Hello, my name is McKeen. I am participating in this conference today to share with you insights on the FDA regulatory process as it relates to EO sterilization changes. Here's the session overview, and I have prepared my talk to cover each of these objectives. Throughout this program, you've been provided with a significant amount of technical information, so my attempt here will be to blend that information with the current regulatory and social environment into the context of how to reduce the use of EO and continue to run your business and sterilize your products without disruption. I am a regulatory scientist, so my stock and trade is helping the business navigate the regulatory waters towards approval. You can't accomplish that if you don't comply with the regulations and the rules, and there is no I in approval, as it takes a team to win at this process. Here's the agenda for the session. I will start with what triggered the focus on EO as a sterilization method for medical devices and why it's a big deal. I will also frame this with what are some of the challenges facing your business, along with some strategies to address them and to the benefits of moving to a reduced EO usage level in your sterilization cycles. I will also provide an overview of the Master File pilot program at FDA and considerations for your company should they decide to participate in this program. I will close with some takeaways and resources. So what happened to make EO as a sterilization agent for medical devices a public concern? Well, the flag was tripped back in February of 2019 when the Illinois State EPA issued a seal order on the Sterigenics Willowbrook facility. This order was triggered by the residents living nearby the facility and protesting the EO emissions that facility was producing in their neighborhoods. Now, there is a lot of history on this issue, and I won't even attempt to delve into any of the legal or business aspects of it. Suffice it to say that through the residents contacting their local government representatives, aided by the use of social media platforms, this became a high-profile issue and one that could not be ignored. Here we have some social media pictures of protests and demonstrations outside the facility. You can see the map of the facility is surrounded by schools and neighborhood housing. The Sterigenics facility predates many of these buildings, so it continues to evolve as a concern to the local residents. There's also been a long history of EO, with the most recent being back in the 1990s when there was a coordinated effort to replace ethylene oxide with radiation methods for sterilization. Time passed and the EPA ruling in 2016 has added EO to the carcinogen list of cancer-causing agents, which led to the public to take action in Illinois. It soon spread to surrounding states and facilities as mentioned here, and it resulted in disruptions to the healthcare product supply chain. This led to a chain of events. The sterilization facility closures resulted in immediate product shortages in the US, and that alerted FDA to get engaged on this issue. So why was there an instant product shortage issue, you ask? Well, like many manufacturing processes, the goal is to maximize yield and minimize waste, so the sterilization industry is motivated to sell off all chamber capacity and run near full capacity, which is what was occurring at the time of these shutdowns. Similar to the well-established FDA process of tracking and reporting on drug shortages, the FDA worked to put in place a program for anticipating and identifying medical device shortages associated with EO sterilization facility shutdowns. So FDA stepped up and formed a task force on the issue and collaborated with industry and sterilization providers to identify solutions to prevent further product shortages and address the public's concerns and calls for replacement of ethylene oxide as a sterilant for medical devices. I give great credit to the FDA for acting quickly and responsibly on this issue, on top of all the other priorities they are managing, and that's even pre-COVID. In response to the they announced an innovation challenge in July of 2019 to encourage and engage manufacturers and sterilization providers on two key initiatives. One, development of alternative methods of sterilization to replace EO, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And two, develop methodologies to reduce the amount of EO gas used in your current sterilization process. So really validation schemes and compliance methods for you to employ to reduce the use of EO. This was launched and continues to be a voluntary program, and essentially what these 2 points did was set the agenda for the work to be done by industry and the stakeholders. This led to the FDA holding a public advisory committee meeting in November, where the key stakeholders in the process, manufacturers, sterilization contractors, healthcare providers, and patient advocates, met for 2 days to discuss this key issue. It was clear from this meeting that EO is not going away anytime soon without major disruption to the healthcare system. So some of the key takeaways in this meeting were, given the reality that there is not an immediate replacement for ethylene oxide sterilization, the work must continue to support EO concentration reduction initiatives, and we'll talk more about that as well. Consider opportunities to incentivize industry towards more efficient sterilization cycle design by streamlining the regulatory process, which is where the Master File program comes in, and we'll speak to here in a moment. Again, all stakeholders continue to invest in infrastructure, design, and improvement of EO facilities to move towards the reduced EO emissions, which is really the public concern and threat, and set clear standards and guidance for alternative validation practices to reduce EO in your cycles, and really harmonize this and socialize this across the industries. This is not proprietary type testing. This is really science-based, driven by standards and sterility levels. So there's not really a lot of ways to accomplish that, but certainly standardize those to the extent we can. So running in the background to all this was the concern and the question as to what would EPA do against EO. Now, picture this, we're with the current administration, and there was a fair amount of turnover in leadership of EPA and the public outcry. This is all pre-COVID. EPA was really set to change their EO limits and basically move it to essentially zero emissions for medical device sterilizers. Okay, that's the details in their Federal Register notice, and that decision is coming later in 2021, I think in part because of the administration and in part because of COVID, because if they were continuing to shut down sterilization facilities, there'd be even less PPE. So suffice it to say that the bell has been rung, and it's time for all stakeholders to take steps to reduce EO in their sterilization process and develop scalable methods to replace EO, but that's many, many years away. So riding this wave of collaboration, the FDA announced an EO reduction master file pilot program in the Federal Register on November 26th. This presented an alternative regulatory pathway for industry to report changes related to the reduction of EO use for PMA products. Here again, credit goes out to FDA for stepping up and providing new regulatory pathways to incentivize industry and reduce the burden of making the shift to EO reduction. Here's a graphic of a typical EO cycle that FDA presented at the November meeting that I really like if you're not really familiar with EO sterilization. This is a very good illustration of the many steps involved in the process. EO sterilization is a very complicated process when compared to, say, E-beam or gamma radiation sterilization. The typical EO cycle has around 100 process steps and can take anywhere from 20 hours to a few days to complete with aeration. What possibly could go wrong? In fact, it's really quite remarkable that these cycles run with those variables and these temperatures and these chemicals as reliably as they do. And it's really a testament to the great work the industry does to validate this critical process. So you can see from this graphic that there's a preconditioning phase to stabilize the temperature of the product prior to going into the sterilization vessel, which involves many vacuum draws, steam injection, EO ejection, and then several nitrogen flushes that contribute to the reduction of the EO presence of gas. And then there's a long aeration phase, which basically is an airing out of that product. So it can take a few hours to a few days to aerate the product to get rid of the residuals before the product can be released and sold and put into commerce. So why is EO such a big deal? Well, it started back in the 1930s when EO was discovered as an effective sterilant. Fast forward to today, and it's the most commonly used method for healthcare products, representing over 50% of the products supplied in the United States. This amounts to over 20 billion products a year in the US alone. Yes, that's 20 billion with a B. In order to support that kind of high volume, you need a process that is scalable, and EO provides just that, representing millions of pallets a year in just the US. What also favors EO is the science behind the method as a sterilant, and it's the most compatible with a wide variety of materials that are used in today's medical device designs, principally polymers and plastics, as it allows for achieving 10 to the minus 6 sterility assurance levels while not degrading the molecular structure of these materials. Now, I'm no scientist, I just know it works. And gamma is not compatible with a variety of, well, there are even circuits. You've got microelectronics and a variety of technologies and materials and composites in these modern medical devices. And EO is the most friendly to that wide spectrum. Finally, another consideration lending itself to EO is the product can be validated to run through multiple EO cycles. This is an important risk reduction measure to single shot sterilization, in that if there's a problem with the run, 100 steps, 20 hours, what could go wrong, or there's an equipment failure, say you lose a vacuum pump, that you can validate it to run through a second cycle and not scrap the product. Some of these other technologies are single shot, and if you've got expensive product, particularly combination products with a drug constituent, there's risk that something could go wrong and you could lose the load. So what are some of the challenges of reducing EO in your cycles? I know this is kind of a busy slide, so bear with me. As we know, EO sterilization is a complex process, so validation of the process and equipment maintenance is critical. You don't want to lose a vacuum pump in the middle of the run, as I mentioned. The majority of PPE for COVID, personal protection equipment, is sterilized with EO. So clearly under the pandemic, the idea of over-regulating or shutting down EO facilities would further disrupt the supply chain in the US. EPA is continuing to be under pressure from the public to implement and enforce zero emissions. Fugitive emissions sounds like something out of a prison movie, and as it suggests, it refers to the EO gas and residuals that escape the chamber during the process and are released into the ambient air that we breathe. EPA has issued a Federal Register notice to outline the monitoring and reporting on this issue now in response to this, and we're in this sort of reporting period. They haven't made their decision on the limits, but they're collecting data. And of course, this precludes the soon to be updated regulation and the NEOSH and all these other regulations, which I'm not an expert at, but I know it's going to be essentially zero emissions from these facilities. For FDA products and changes to the EO sterilization process, the regulation requires submissions and prior approval for changes to Class 3 PMA products. For those of you that have those products, it's a big deal. It's a very bright line between PMA and 510K Class 2 products in the US. Whereas for 510K Class 2, there is no submission or prior clearance when making these types of changes to your cycle. They can be reported under a letter to file and managed as part of your quality system. For those of you that are supporting and working through the EU MDR, that transition is a much different story. One of the interesting aspects of sterilization is that reporting requirements can be different between the FDA and notified bodies, and in fact, even between notified bodies have different requirements for sterilization changes. This effectively requires a dual sterilization strategy from a regulatory standpoint and from a process standpoint to separate these work streams for submission and reporting changes. Overall, the testing and data set requirements are the same that will come out of your scientific operations. And based on your quality system requirements and validation process, it requires your regulatory representatives to sort all this out. Suffice it to say, it gets complicated for a large company with thousands of products across multiple notified bodies in multiple geographies with multiple chambers. The beauty of the FDA is that there's one FDA and a common set of requirements for managing the sterilization changes. And finally, in addition, aside from the EU MDR requirements, many EU countries, environmental agencies, much like the US EPA, are stepping up their engagement in this issue and are surveying companies on sterilization providers about what products are being sterilized in the EU 27, was 28, the UK's out now, how many jobs are associated with this process, and the environmental impact. So similar to US EPA, they are interested in the company's plans to move to zero emissions and alternative methods for sterilizing other than EO. Despite the challenges of using EO as a sterilant, there are also benefits to reducing EO usage. While sterilization is certainly a critical process and all of the costs, every penny of the cost and investment of that company is tied up in that product when it enters the chamber, right? So it's pretty important. The validation methodologies that I've mentioned here are really well characterized and understood by both regulators and industry and can easily be updated and adapted to reduce the EO level. Reducing EO levels naturally reduces the cycle time as less gas requires fewer nitrogen, well, less dwell time to put in the gas, fewer nitrogen washes, and less aeration time to drive off the EO residuals. There's a direct cost savings as the price of EO continues to rise in this environment, and it's a material part of the cost of the cycle. So less EO means less overall, also means less overall abatement equipment duty time and can contribute to cycle time reduction. Supply chains can also benefit from improved throughput times and reduced inventory levels given the shorter cycle times. And while you're tracking or taking the time to revalidate your cycles with a reduced EO, you can consider introducing parametric release to the products to further reduce the supply chain and distribution work stream efficiencies. And finally, the direct and indirect benefit of reducing fugitive emissions will allow for both environmental sustainability, risk reduction with the regulators such as EPA, and employee safety. From an operations standpoint, inform the leadership of your the supply chain risk and the resources required to prevent product shortages and excess inventory. This can prove to be more challenging for short shelf life products as the company transitions to a lower EO cycle. Your sterilization team of engineers and scientists will be kept very busy planning and executing this transition. Existing IQ, OQ, PQ methodologies can be adapted to reduce EO cycles and target around 400 milligrams per liter of EO gas in your cycle, which was what's presented and discussed at the November FDA meeting. This is a level that has demonstrated that the product will still meet the sterility assurance level of 10 to the minus 6. Right now with the COVID pandemic, it's an opportune time for your company, large or small, to secure chamber time for these validation efforts. Prior to COVID, the sterilization network was effectively running at capacity, as we had mentioned, and it was a challenge, particularly for small firms, to get a contract sterilizer to return their calls, and then also give them time at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday night to run their validation run. So it's kind of an opportunity associated with the COVID for the moment, but will likely go away once we're on the other side of this. Your regulatory team is a key partner in this process from a global implementation strategy standpoint. As your regulatory member of the team, I played a central role in developing US strategy to engage FDA and facilitate submissions and approvals structured around the changes to reduce EO in our cycles. How your firm and your quality system defines such a change is important. For example, if this change to reduce EO is considered a manufacturing change, it would be a 30-day notice. If it's tied up in your design documentation and in your source design specifications of your product, and you make a change, that requires a real-time review or 180-day submission, as it suggests, 6 times longer than a 30-day notice to make that change. So another important consideration, the way your quality system is structured and built around sterilization activities. And as I had mentioned, if your company only sells Class 2 510K products in the US, then you'll have a lot of freedom, and you can move on to the next session, not really, to reduce the use of EO without getting to FDA prior clearance. But again, however, if you have Class 3 PMA products in the US, then the FDA Master File Program may be of interest to your company to streamline the implementation of these reductions. So I got a couple screen snaps here. Here's the FDA webpage and address. Link should be live and active in the copy of the slides. And this is dedicated to help an industry reduce the use of EO and work towards finding alternative methods. FDA continues to update this website with information and guidance on what companies can do to reduce EO. And you can see here from the Master File Program that Boston Scientific was the first company to be accepted into the Master File Program. So it's not a traditional submission and approval. There's nothing to approve. You submit your body of work and methodologies and protocols, and FDA accepts it for you to annual report it. We'll get into some of those mechanics. And then here just recently, Becton Dickinson was also entered into this pilot, of which they're targeting 9 companies. Another important link here is the Federal Register notice that announced the Master File Program back in November. This notice provides all the specific requirements to apply to this program. It's really quite prescriptive for an FR notice by design. And again, they indicated that they're targeting 9 companies, but I suspect they would accept more if it turns out to be a popular program. So what is central to the Master File Program is to allow for changes made to the sterilization process related to the reduction of the use of EO in your cycle. Given the variety of EO cycles and the currently being used, there's a number of changes that fall under this umbrella. The advantage of the Master File Program is twofold. Either a company, OEM, like Boston Scientific or BD, we hold a master file, or 2, a contract sterilizer provider holds a master file. There isn't one yet, at least that's on the website. If your company holds, like Boston Scientific, the master file, that you can annual report the changes to your process for your PMA products related to reducing EO, and that includes adding new sites and reducing EOs, adding chambers. There's a variety of even changing out a pump to accommodate the new reduced EO cycle, including any facility changes to move towards zero emissions. Now, if and when a contract sterilizer is accepted into this program and your company happens to use them, and I'll say Sterigenics, I've presented with, not Sterigenics, Steris is a really quite a large contract sterilizer. We work with them. I just presented with them last month, and they're very engaged and very happy and eager to work with you to reduce the EO cycles, the EO in your cycles, and get through the validation process and assist you in any way they can. And of course, using that, then they as a holder can authorize you as an OEM to annual report this for your PMA and reference their master file number. So that in a nutshell is the value of the master files. You get away from the submission burden and you can just annual report and move forward. So the criteria to qualify for a master file program is very straightforward and again, very well defined in the Federal Register notice. You must be a sterilization provider of a single-use device, provided sterile, makes sense. You must be in good compliance and standing with FDA with no open warning letters or regulatory actions, makes sense. And you need to have an approved fixed chamber that's used to sterilize products. Currently, portable chambers are not part of the scope. And one really important note here, while it's in the Federal Register notice, you got to really pay attention. The program excludes combination products, for example, drug-eluted stents, coronary stents, very popular combination product. The reason for this is that the program is administered by and managed by CDRH, which is the device branch at FDA. And including the combination products requires CDRH to consult with CDER, the drug branch at FDA, on changes. And of course, that process would undermine the annual reporting approach if CDER took a month to ask a question, it could be too late. As I mentioned, FDA is targeting 9 companies to participate in this program, and it's consistent with several other pilots that FDA's got underway. Okay, so we're wrapping up here. So the FR notice mentioned in the Federal Register is quite prescriptive and requires to both qualify for the pilot and the information to be included in the application so it's accepted into the program. The scope of the master file includes all your PMA products you're selling, all the EO sterilization cycles you're running, if there's multiple, that are being targeted for reduction, the sterilization sites, including those worldwide or your global sterilization network, and the reduction methodology and protocols related to the validation of the reduced EO cycle. We call those master validation plans. So that's all got to be in there. As a master file, it does not contain data or reports. Therein lies the importance of these protocols to define the predetermined acceptance criteria to be followed and met in order to consider the reduced EO cycle process validated. The results of this testing and the reference to the data and reports is what's contained in the annual reports via this process. Finally, one note, the program is on a 6-month amendment cycle versus 12-month cycle, common with PMAs. And this shorter period is good because it enables the holder to provide updated information on cycles, sites, and protocols and methodology as they continue to make these changes. So it seems to be just about the right cadence. So here I have an example of a table of contents for a master file application. And again, this is based directly on what is provided in the Federal Register. So there are many key takeaways related to both the strategy and plans to reduce the EO in your sterilization process, as well as whether your company decides to participate in the master file program. Be sure your company's leadership is up to date and aware of the current and coming risks to the company's supply of products. While it's not enforceable at the moment, eventually it's believed that the reduced EO cycles will be required by FDA, EPA, and certainly the EU. Working with your regulatory team and/or consultants, it's important to develop strategies for both the US and the rest of the world on timing and sequencing of regulatory approvals across the company's global sterilization network. The bright line here is whether your company sells PMA products or 510K products, and that applies, the class 3 applies to Europe as well, and the EU MDR requirements. Certainly develop science-based methodologies and data sets to support the reduction of EO and address any possible impact on the product resulting from the changes in the cycle parameters. Very important point to stress here. I didn't have it in the body of my presentation, but product impact assessments are a key part of this regulatory and science process that you've either through product testing or determined that there is no impact to your product performance, because that's a whole nother work stream that can take months, years, millions of dollars to re-DV your product. So an important consideration for your engineering team. As I mentioned, now is a good time to work with your contract sterilization providers on available technical support and to secure chamber time to conduct your validation activities to reduce the EO in your cycles across your network. Because again, we get to the other side of the pandemic and we're up to full scale healthcare operations of elective procedures and so on. There may not be a lot of capacity left in the system. And finally, take advantage of the cost savings and reductions throughout the time associated by reducing the use of EO in your sterilization cycle and throughput times. So one final thought that I can share from my perspective is what happens to the master file program at FDA. Well, like all pilot programs at FDA, it will likely result in new and updated guidance documents that reflect what was learned in the pilot and bring forward best practices around that. Since these processes to reduce and replace EO will take many years, look for the FDA to continue to identify least burdensome methods and regulatory pathways to implement sterilization changes while ensuring the safety and effectiveness of the process and the products. So here is a list of the resources I actually footnoted throughout the presentation. The transcript for the November meeting, I think, is about 600 pages, and it's on the website, but it's word searchable. So if there's something in particular, even say you want to do vapor deposition, that's the work you're doing, you can find it in there. So the FDA did a real nice job in preparing not only the meetings, but producing the outputs from that. So with that, that's what I have to share with you today. I'd like to thank you for participating in this program.